Alright, today we're going to make the bread. I have here 1 tablespoon plus 3/4 of a teaspoon of yeast, and to that I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of ginger. I learned this from a cookbook by Ada Lou Roberts. The ginger really helps the yeast to get going. And then a 1/4 cup of warm water. If you've made bread before, you pretty much know what temperature the water needs to be. If you're new to it, I would basically say the water needs to be very warm, but not so hot that it burns you if you stick your finger in it, even for several seconds. That way you know it's not hot enough that it's going to kill the yeast, but it really does need to be warm enough to get the yeast woken up and moving around. And then a teaspoon of honey. I just squirt some honey in there and stir it around. A small squirt. And then stir this all up so that it's thoroughly mixed. And then you'll let it sit and wait until the yeast gets very foamy. With the ginger in there especially to proof this yeast, it foams up quite a bit. It makes a really neat consistency actually. It's kind of fun to work with. I find that having this much yeast in the water, the yeast kind of gets clumpy and you have to work a little extra hard to stir it up. But I try to get as many of the lumps smoothed out as I can, because you don't really want clumps of yeast in your finished product. Sometimes I actually can get my fingers in there and just kind of smush it into the water. And then once that's all mixed together, we'll let that sit for about 5 minutes to proof. And meanwhile, I will add the salt to the bread. And I don't remember how much salt I'm supposed to add. 1 second. 2 1/4 teaspoons of salt. Now, I let this bread dough that's supposed to be soaking sit for longer than the 24 hours. So it's gotten a little bit hard on top. It should be perfectly fine, and I can tell this is a very crumbly kind of hard on top, so it's going to all mix together just fine. Hopefully, it does not cause any problems in the bread. I would think if anything, a longer soaking should make it easier to work with. It's just kind of one of those life things that happens sometimes. So there's the salt. This has been soaking for less than 48 hours, but I think it's probably about 42 hours or something like that. And then we're all ready to start kneading this as soon as the yeast is done proofing. You can see the yeast mixture has gotten very foamy and is almost filling the bowl. If I let it go long enough, it might actually overflow the bowl. You really need to make sure you have a large enough bowl, because this is probably at least 3 times the original volume of the yeast mixture. And so then I'll put this in here and turn on the mixer at a low speed. On my mixer, the kneading speed is the 2 setting. It's not supposed to go higher for something tough like bread dough. And let it run. I will probably check it after 10 minutes, but it usually takes longer than that to really get it kneaded. And I will show you the bread dough at the different stages and how you can know when it is done and ready to rise. Alright, the dough has now been kneading for about 10 minutes, and you can see here it's starting to all hold together in the middle of the bowl around the dough hook. I forgot to mention that because this dough is so stiff to start with, you may need to push it down with a spatula or something, turn off the mixer, push it down towards the middle again, and then turn it on for a couple of minutes, and maybe repeat that. But by that time it should start to stick together pretty well in the middle and work just fine. Now right now, this dough is holding together pretty well. It stretches out somewhat, but you can see there when I try to stretch it thin, it just tears very quickly. which means this dough is not even really close to being ready. When it's ready, it will stretch out very thin, and you can almost see through the bread dough. So we're going to knead it for another 10 minutes and then come back and see how it looks. It's actually been about 5 more minutes for a total of 15, and I just wanted to show you what it looks like now. It stretches out much thinner than it did before, but it still tears pretty quickly when it gets to that super thin stage, or at least it was a second ago. There you go. It's tearing like that when you try to stretch it out very thin, but you can see how thin it's getting. So it probably just needs a few more minutes, maybe another 5. So I'll be checking on it pretty frequently here. Alright, it's been another 5 minutes. This dough is looking pretty good. I think it's still tearing just a little too easily. You get one without any pre-tears in it. Smush it all back together and then stretch it out. Well, now I'm going to say that looks pretty good. It is tearing a little there up in the corner, but I mean it only goes so thin anyway before it has to tear. And there you can see some of the webbing of the gluten, and you can see where it's getting just super thin there before it tears. So I think that bread dough looks good. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the same bowl to let it rise in, but I am going to take the bread dough out and put just a little olive oil in the bottom of the bowl so it doesn't stick. You can use really any oil you want. Olive oil is what I usually have around that's easy to grab, but you can use coconut oil, or honestly I've even done it without any oil at all, and yeah, it sticks to the bowl a little bit, but it's not going to ruin your bread or anything. So what I do is I put the oil in the bottom of the bowl, put the dough in, flip it over so all sides are nicely oiled, and then put this someplace warm to rise. Because I don't have a gas oven and it's winter time, I'm going to turn my electric oven on low and then set this on the stove top, and that should be about the right amount of heat. My dough has been rising for about 2 hours. It should be more like an hour and a half, but it's a little chilly in the kitchen even over the oven apparently. So I'm going to go ahead and punch it down. I'm turning up my oven a little bit so that it will rise a little faster this time. I'm going to have it at 200 and set the dough on top of it to rise again. The second rising should take about half as long as the first one. So normally it would be about an hour and a half for the first one, 45 minutes for the second one, but I'm counting on an hour for the second rising since the first one took longer. And I just punched it down. And you can skip the second rising if you don't have enough time, but it really does make for better consistency, so try to plan on time for the second rising too. Here's my dough. It's actually been rising for about an hour. It's just slow rising today. When you're making bread, you really just have to work with how it goes and not try to make it work too much on your schedule. But that's risen pretty well now, so I'm going to punch it down again. Work out the air bubbles here. And then I'm going to make 1 loaf of bread, and then the other loaf's worth of dough I'm going to make into some rolls. I'll show you how I make hamburger rolls and how I make hot dog rolls. And of course show you how I shape the loaf of bread dough. And then this will need to rise again. And the simplest way to do that is to have your oven slightly heated, like mine has been heating on low anyway for the bread dough to rise, and then put your bread dough inside the oven and turn it off and let it rise that way. And that way you don't have to move it before turning it on. And this dough, I've got half the dough just kind of stretched out nicely here, and then I just kind of tuck the edges underneath to make a loaf. There are lots of different ways of doing that. That's just the way I find simplest to shape the loaf. If you have trouble with it, you can roll it out into a rectangle and then roll it up almost like a cinnamon roll and put it in your loaf pan. I've already greased my loaf pan, again using olive oil because that's what I had handy. And there's the loaf sitting there in the loaf pan. And then for the rolls, I'm going to divide this in half, and this one I'm going to divide in 3 for hamburger rolls. That would be 6 hamburger rolls out of the 1 loaf of dough. And this makes a really hearty size hamburger roll. I know it looks small now, but it will rise. And my husband likes that because he can put 2 hamburger patties on the same bun and it still works and the bun holds it all. If you like a smaller hamburger roll, or if you want more of a dinner-sized roll, you can divide it into 8 pieces for the loaf. And I just kind of tuck the edges underneath and then flatten it out a little bit. Nothing fancy or complicated. And then this other half of the dough I'm going to divide into 4 pieces, which would be 1/8 of the loaf's worth of bread dough. And with these I'm going to make hot dog buns. And this I just kind of roll out into a worm shape here. Just pretend you're working with Play-Doh. This is what I always used to do with my Play-Doh, is make worm shapes and then make stuff out of the worms. And then just make it roughly hot dog shaped, and then it will rise to be enough bigger than the hot dog to make a good bun. And just like you can make the hamburger buns smaller, you can also make the hot dog buns larger by dividing it into 6 pieces, but that's really much more of like a Polish sausage or brat size bun at that point. And then once you have your bread all shaped, you put it into rise for probably another 20 to 30 minutes, again, just until it seems about doubled. And even the doubled is really kind of subjective. You just kind of have to eye it and gauge it, because it's really hard to tell what's exactly doubled on something that is not a distinct geometric shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this into rise, and when it seems doubled, I'm just going to turn the oven on to 350. The rolls will probably be done about 20 minutes after I turn the oven on, and the bread more like 30 to 40 minutes after I turn the oven on. This is the bread after rising for about 40 minutes and then cooking. It only cooked for about 20 minutes, but the rolls are definitely done. And they came out a little smaller than normal. I was just having problems with rising today. That happens, but I can tell the texture is still very fluffy and good on this bread. And these are the hot dog rolls. And then this is the bread. This has had a few minutes to cool already, but I'll show you. Normally I'll take a knife around the edge here to just loosen up the edges. And then with hot pads, I'll flip it out like this so that I can test the bottom, and if it sounds hollow when you tap on it, then it's usually done. And that is 100% whole wheat bread that white bread people actually like. So enjoy.